Hey guys, welcome to the Girl Take No podcast. I am your host, Shaunie Sanders, and today I have with me special guest Jim White. Jim White. I'm about to say Jim Founder. Jim White, I know, right? He is founder of the Family Enrichment Academy. He is author of How to Be the Best Parent, how to be the parent your teen needs you to be, which is a very good topic. I want to talk about that. He's been married 40 years. He has 6 kids, 12 grandchildren. Let's say he is a veteran in the game. Okay. When it comes to family. Jim, welcome to the show.
Absolutely. A pleasure and glad to be here.
Thank you so much for taking the time. I think this is going to be a really good conversation when it comes around parenting, especially parenting teens, as I have a lot of friends who children are moving to that preteen, teenager stage. And, you know, they're acting different and parenting them. It's a real transition. It's a real transition to see them kind of grow. So I think it's going to be a great conversation. But before we get into that, I want you to give me the story behind the brand. What made you get into not just your 40 years of being married to being a dad and stuff like that, but what made you start the Family Enrichment Academy?
Well, and actually the two things are connected, the time spent as a dad. And the way I would describe it, I've always had a passion for personal development, parenting, marriage, just that area.
Yeah.
And I've spent the last 40 years studying the topic, to be quite honest. But more importantly, I've also spent the 40 years applying the lessons learned as a parent and as a husband. Mm-hmm. And actually, when I tell the story, I like to use the analogy of a hero's 2 journeys. Mm-hmm. And I know you do a lot of storytelling, so you may be familiar with that idea, but for your audience that's not, the premise is that in any movie or book, the hero or the main character is on 2 different journeys. The first journey is a journey of accomplishment. There's some goal or task that they're trying to accomplish. And it's entertaining, but what makes the story compelling is the second journey, and that's known as the journey of fulfillment. And so what's happening is the main character, as they're pursuing that outside goal, they're also going through this internal transformation, right? They're discovering new principles, values, and beliefs that just make their life work better. Yeah. And that's the second journey. So how this connects to me in my role as a parent is, as you can imagine, there was a lot of outside tasks to accomplish with 6 kids. We had homework to help with, meals to cook, places to be. I like to say that we were 6 kids busy, which was, very busy, right?
Yes.
And so, but what's interesting is, as I was doing all that stuff that a parent does, all that outside task, I was also experiencing this amazing internal transformation as well. And it was just through my interest in personal development, parenting and marriage, I was discovering the principles, values, and beliefs that just made our family work better. Yes. Right? And so that process was happening. And actually for me, it's been over 20 years ago now, I actually started writing a little bit, almost like, think of it as like journaling. And it was a way for me to process ideas and thoughts and just sort of engage with that growth process. Yeah. Well, where I'm at now and sort of how I've gotten here is my kids, for the most part, are grown and gone. My youngest is 21. Actually, she's in college. And you mentioned I have grandchildren, which actually I need to update that. I've had another one since I wrote that.
Oh, wow. Congratulations.
But I find myself at a point in my life where the only way for me to describe it is that I'm feeling called to share some of the wisdom gained over these last 40 years. Yeah. And so I formed that Family Enrichment Academy out of that calling. And I'll just go ahead and share 2 of the fundamental beliefs that have sort of evolved. And this is at the core of what we try to do, is the idea that everyone deserves to be seen for who they are and loved unconditionally. So that's sort of the first premise. And then the second premise is that we all deserve to be surrounded by others that lift us up and empower us to be our absolute best. So those are like 2 sort of foundational beliefs that sort of led to me forming the Family Enrichment Academy. And then what we did, to be quite honest, the mission is to empower families, and we'll talk about this going forward, but the goal is to empower families to choose love over fear regardless of the circumstance that they're dealing with.
Mm-hmm.
And then, how I do that is, I published a book that you mentioned. I do one-on-one coaching. I do workshops. I produce content on a regular basis. It's all sort of in line with those principles and values. So that's sort of the 40-year journey of how I got here and then sitting with you today.
Yes. I like that. To love unconditionally. It's so funny you mentioned that, because I was just having a conversation with my girlfriends, and, we're all married, and we talk about relationships. I know it's not parenting, but the unconditional piece of love. I feel like today a lot of people love with conditions, meaning like, I'll love you if you don't do this and if you don't do that. Do we think parenting works in that way too? Not that they don't love them, but the fact that I love you more and you'll get more if you behave like this, and if you do this, and if you do your chores, and if you do that, then you get more love from a person. Do you think parents kind of like, as parents, we kind of like fall into that kind of realm as well?
Absolutely. And actually, I'll reposition it a little bit rather than saying unconditional love.
Yeah.
And I mentioned this, I encourage parents to think of it this way. All of us, within us, we have two competing mindsets. One of the mindsets is fear-based, and the other one is love-based.
Yeah.
And every moment of every day, we're engaging either from that fearful mindset or from the loving mindset. And what
That's
you're
true.
describing is the unconditional love. I would say it's really, you're coming from more of a fear. It's not really love that's unconditional. It's you're fearful.
Yeah.
And part of it, like let's say a teenager doesn't do something that the parent wants them to do. To be quite honest, a lot of time the parent is embarrassed by that, let's say. And so they're starting to feel some fear around, oh, I'm not good enough, or I'm not doing the right, I'm not parenting correctly. And so out of that fear, they respond. And typically it comes across as being like unconditional love. It's like, okay, you need to do this, then I'll feel better, and then we can go forward. Well, part of my work with parents is helping them to be intentional in choosing to be more love-based, and recognizing when they're not being love-based. And to be quite honest, a lot of us, the fearful response has become the default, if you will, or the natural response. We tend to go to that first, and we've been conditioned that way. And so sometimes it's a little bit of a challenge to start to shift into more of a love-based mindset. It's kind of, I like to use the analogy of health and wellness a lot.
Yeah.
And we get used to eating donuts every day, then it's hard to break that habit, right?
Yeah.
So
It is.
It's a matter of starting to break those habits of being more fearful in our response. So I parents obviously love their children, but we don't always act out of that love.
Yeah.
And that's the distinction, in a moment. And it's when I like to say life puts the squeeze on you, something happens, puts some pressure on. And a lot of times when that pressure comes, we tend to act more out of the fearful mindset. So that's another way of saying what you mentioned.
Yeah. I was watching something just the other day, and a young man, was this dating show. I think it's called Love is Blind. And he talked about his father, and he said that he's afraid that he's going to raise his children like his father did, which is because the woman was like, I don't want to be very strict on my kids because my parents are so strict on me. They're very religious and they're very strict on me. And I don't want to be like that. My children, his thing was that he's so afraid that he's going to be like his dad, because what his dad did to him was he wasn't good at math. And his dad said to him, if you're not good at math, then you're going to get taken advantage of, and you're going to end up being like a bum on the street begging for pennies, and I'm going to drive past you. And he talked about how that really affected him. And he said that, I don't blame my father for what he did, because what he thought he was doing was positive, positive parenting.
Right.
And so I think about that a lot, because I think about how the older generation were raised, and a lot of them, like one of my sisters always complained how my mom says, oh, you never tell me you love me. And I think I'm the youngest of I'm a big family too. I'm the youngest of 12. And my mom always said it to me, because, I'm the baby, I came last, but that was always her complaint. And I feel like, our parents only parent from what they saw and how their parents did. And they felt like, well, if it worked with me, then it needs to work with you. But the young man mentioned how his dad saying that to him really affected him. So let's talk about how important is it the power of words, especially when it comes to teenagers, and how we speak to them and what we say to them and how we encourage them. Because sometimes parents think, now that I learned from you operating out of fear, you think if I say this, it's going to make you, if I say, you know what, you're going to end up not being nothing in life if you don't do this. They were thinking that's a positive thing because it'll motivate them to want to be something. So let's talk about words and how they can affect a child's psyche and their way of becoming a parent as well.
Right. And the words are very powerful. Mm-hmm. And they come from how you're seeing the situation, how the parent sees, which real quick, before we get to that, it's interesting. People tend to either parent just like their parents did because that's just what they know, or as you mentioned too, sometimes they say, I'm going to go complete opposite. It's like, I need to go complete, and so they really try to be intentional about being the opposite of their parents. It's kind of an interesting dynamic. And part of the, I get this a lot too, is the idea of how can I break the cycle? Sometimes there's this repeating cycle from generation to generation, and they want to break that. And to be quite honest, the first step in that is to adopt that growth mindset. The idea that you can grow, you can learn, you can develop. And with that, things can be different tomorrow than they are today, right? And that's all comes from that growth mindset. And that's really the source of hope when you think about it. That's where the hope comes from, was when you realize, okay, things can be different tomorrow. And then to the comment about words, I mean, words are very powerful. But I would also assert that the context that a parent speaks from, I mean, I can say, I love you, but if I do it from a mean place or a sarcastic place, we communicate by our context as well. And just our presence will communicate also. So I would add that to this. And that's why the title of my book is How to Be the Parent Your Teen Needs You to Be. That be is very important. We want to be love-based, and we want to engage from a love-based perspective, because that will come through as well when you say the words also. So it's a combination of both. And, and part of what I try to coach parents on is, shifting that mindset. And then it's a matter of, okay, like you mentioned, somebody who's bad at math, and dad kind of leaned on, say, hey, if you're not good at this, if you think they're trying to use fear as a motivator in that case. And that, to be quite honest, what the teen then feels is they feel not good enough, and they start to feel isolated, and they feel disconnected. And that disconnect is a scary place to be. I mean, think about for you, for me, for any of us, if we feel isolated or alone or different, that disconnection it's fearful, and we become fearful. And so part of my message for parents is build connection. That's one of the key fundamentals, is how do we build connection? And then, as I mentioned, how do we then empower the teen to be their absolute best? And if the subject is math, it's a matter of, okay, how can we empower? And part of it's seeing them for who they are. I mean, we're not all the same when it comes to math. I don't know how you were. I wasn't
good in it either.
Math was a strong suit. It was a strong suit for me, but it's not for everybody. And so it's seeing them for who they are. And for one child, getting a B in algebra could be a huge accomplishment. And for another, they need the advanced calculus class, and they should get an A+ in it just because of their skill set, right? And so part of the parent's role is to recognize and see the child for who they are, and then work to empower them to be their absolute best. And so, that shift in mindset will have you shift your words then. It's not, hey, you need to do this no matter what. It's how can we help you to be your best at algebra or math or whatever it is. And part of the message with teens is to shift some responsibility to them and start to teach them to, like, a huge thing that I think gets missed a lot is the idea of teaching your teen to be resourceful, right? And now we can teach them math all day long, but a much more important skill is to learn to be resourceful. And we can use the math class as a vehicle for teaching resourcefulness, right? So you say to the teen, what could you do that would help you get through this class? What resources, could you talk to the teacher? Do you do a study group? You start having them think through and try to come up with solutions to solve that problem for them. what's your goal for this? You ask the teen, what would be a stretch goal for you in this math class? And they might say, I'd like to get a B.
Yeah.
Okay, where are you right now? I'm at a C-. What do you need to do between now and the end of the semester to get to the B? You start walking them through and having them learn to think through a situation and help to solve their own problems. That's the shift that happens when you're a teenager. And so then, of course, your words in that case, as you can see, the words become more like questions. It's not like a statement or a demand. It's a question, and it's a presence of how you're being with them that communicates that you love them and you see them for who they are, and you're there in support of them becoming the best they could possibly be.
Yeah.
So, kind of a long-winded answer, but
no,
it's a little bold.
It's definitely a good answer. How do you as a parent, because every child is different, and if you have multiple kids in your house, as you know, because you did, how do you as a parent try to parent each child differently to try to meet them where they are? Like, how do you do that as a parent?
And for me, it's like there's certain fundamentals. And so you sort of lean on the fundamentals, and then you sort of customize from there, if you will. In the three fundamentals, and these are the three that I talk about in the book. And the first one is the parent's mindset, which we've talked about. It's really trying to be mindful and intentional about my own mindset as a parent, and try to stay grounded in love. So that's the first thing. Because if I can stay grounded in love, I'm going to be in a good place then to engage with the child, whichever one we're talking about. The second fundamental is building connection. How do I build connection with the child? Yeah. Now, I've got boys and girls. So, for my boy, and this is how it's different, building connection with him might mean going out into the driveway and playing one-on-one basketball, right? Being playful and engaging in a way that's playful with him. For my daughter, that's not the way I engage to build connection with her. Maybe we go on a bike ride, or maybe we, take a walk around the lake and she talks, or there's other ways. So, but the premise is, the fundamental is building connection. How do I build connection with them? And based on the child's personality, their likes, their interests, you may have some differences there. And then the third fundamental is the idea of empowerment. How do I empower them to be their best? And that's really where the parent has to try to, again, we talked about seeing them for who they are and what are their strengths, and identifying where they are. And it's happened within our family, and I'm sure families that are out there are like this, where, let's take driving, for example. I had one of my daughters that was good driver, ready to go. She turned 16, she, completely comfortable. Another one, she wasn't until she was 17 or that she was really ready to drive. And it's just because they're different, right? And so it's recognizing that. And part of what you see is, if, when we would look, is that my daughter that was not ready, she was still anxious about it, right? And you try to be open and see that in them. But part of it is, here's an example of a parent dismissing feelings. She's anxious. Some parents might say, well, you don't need to be anxious. You'll be fine. You'll be okay. When you say stuff like that, you're dismissing what they're going through, as opposed to just saying, oh, it seems like you're anxious, sort of acknowledging that and being open to, that's okay. That's the other part of it, is if when you come from that love-based perspective, you're forgiving and you're compassionate. So it's okay if she didn't start driving until she was 17. That's, there's nothing wrong with that. And it's a matter of agenda, it's sometimes. So if you try to keep the parent's agenda out and really just be there, I like to say sometimes in service of the child. What does the teenager need from me right now to move them forward on their journey, right? Because they're on a journey as well. And all teens are different. And so if we can keep in mind that our job is to serve them with what is it that they need at that moment to move them forward. That's a good way to kind of work then, because different kids need different stuff, right? They needed it, and they needed it at different times.
How do you talk to the single parent who probably has, children, multiple kids, busy life, and it's hard for them to invest in their kids, to really get to know each individually? How do you talk to that parent who's just kind of like overworked, tired, and maybe lacks in that area? What kind of motivation words can you give them, or what kind of tips you can give them to help them better understand their teenager?
Yeah, yeah, and it can be a challenge, if
Yeah.
you're a single parent. I have not experienced that personally,
Yeah.
obviously, because we've been married, but I know that parents do deal with that. And
Mm-hmm.
one thing is, like I say, one of the keys is your own mindset. And that
Mm-hmm.
doesn't take any extra time. And yet you can be very intentional about trying to be mindful of your mindset.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is, I would throw out that if you're more fearful, that drains your energy.
Yeah.
And one of the things you hear a lot from parents that are in that is that they're overwhelmed and they're struggling and they feel it's tiring to be there. And so one step forward is just for them. They deserve to be in a better place. And I would encourage them to think in terms of their mindset and their perspective and trying to be more love-based. And as they do that, they'll find themselves feeling more energized.
Yeah.
They'll feel more on purpose. And two fundamentals that come out of being more love-based. The first one is being growth-oriented. And to be quite honest, I think a lot of times what happens with parents, and it could be in any situation, but what you're describing is, and we mentioned, there's a loss of hope.
Yeah.
There's not a hope that tomorrow can be different or better than today.
Yeah.
And regaining that hope provides energy and allows you to step into things. And that starts with having a growth mindset. You have to adopt the idea that I can grow and develop and tomorrow can be better than today. So, that becomes a critical component for that parent. And then the second thing, oddly enough, is the idea of being of service to something else or to somebody else. And if you feel like you're in service to something and you feel more purposeful in what you're doing, and in this situation, I mentioned, being of service to your child, how am I serving them? And a lot of times people say, well, I need somebody to help me or serve me.
Yeah.
But it's the odd thing about it is it's that old to give is to receive. And if you start to take on that service mindset, you feel more fulfilled without somebody serving you, if that makes sense.
That does make sense.
You start to feel more filled up. And so, being intentional about mindset, I think, for that parent is the first thing, and trying to be more love-centered and love-based will help them. And then that puts them in a position to then connect and empower their team. And I would assert there too that if time's an issue, they feel like they're constantly running, it doesn't necessarily take more time. The belief is I have to invest more time. And so I'm going to attack that belief and say, I don't know that that's necessarily true.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're carpooling, when you're driving in that car, you're spending 15 minutes in it no matter what. So the question is, how are you utilizing that time?
Yeah.
It's not a matter of having another 15 minutes. It's a matter of more effectively using the 15 minutes you have in the car with the child, bringing them back from school or, wherever it is that you're going.
Yeah.
That morning time, when they're getting ready for school, that time's there. It's a question of how effectively are you using it, or could you be more effective and have it be more pleasant? A lot of times people complain because it's a fight, right?
Yeah.
It's a constant struggle with things. Well, we can transform that into being a pleasant engagement. Then everything's better.
Yeah.
And again, it doesn't take more time. Time is not necessarily the issue. It's the quality of the connection and where you're coming from as a parent.
Yeah. I like that.
In those cases, it starts with the parent, I think.
Yeah, I like that, because you keep mentioning on mindset and the growth mindset, and to lead with love. Because like I said, I think a lot of, myself included too, probably lead with fear. And the reason why, because I was going to bring this up to you, Jim, is that today, in today's world, it is a scary place as a parent, to have children, not just teenagers, but just young children, because there's so many things that they can fall prey to. And
Right.
when you think about this digital world that we live in with social media and everything's online and our kids are exposed to everything now, how as a parent how are you supposed to deal with that? Because now a lot of times our kids are getting most of their information from social media versus coming to their parents for it. And, and I think about how kids are being lured offline, so one question is that how do a parent deal with the digital aspect of parenting now? And the second question I want to ask you is, how do you build trust in your child? And I want to give you, I'm going to give an example of what I'm talking about, but I'll let you answer the first question though.
Yeah. So, and actually, it's interesting. Social media and the digital world is a lot of what I end up talking to parents about.
Yeah.
And interestingly, there's been a lot of rise in anxiety with teenagers, and a lot of that can be attributed to social media. And they're in just what the engagement with social media, what the term is, it's the idea of upward social comparison. Your teen is on there and they're watching things happen on social media, and they're comparing themselves and their life to what's going on social media. Well, one of the issues is we don't know what's really true, right?
Exactly.
On social media.
Exactly. You only get a snippet.
And I don't know if you've ever heard the saying that comparison is the thief of joy.
I like that. I haven't heard it, but that is true.
Yeah, it's true for all of us as adults too. What do? We compare ourselves to other people, and it has a tendency to rob us rather than us just being grateful for where we are and what's going on in our life, and how can I move, one step forward tomorrow. So anyway, back to the social media question though. One of the best lines of defense that a parent can put up, if you will, against social media, and this would have been the same thing, go back 30 years if somebody would ask me about peer pressure, for example. And one of the best lines of defense is the quality of the connection to the parent and to the family. And the deeper and richer that connection, what happens is the child then knows that they have a safe place. So when they feel isolated or alone, or they feel that pressure to do something that maybe they shouldn't do, when they say, I shouldn't do that, and I know I can go home and it's safe there and I'll be okay, as opposed to I shouldn't do that, I have nowhere safe to go, and if I do it, then I'll be accepted by this group, kind of a thing. It provides that alternative or a safe place for them to go. And the other thing that connection communicates is that they're unconditionally loved.
Yeah.
Again, it's safety there. And so having that connection creates a line of defense against all the stuff that's going on with social media. And I just encourage parents not to underestimate the power of that. Yeah. And so in the teen years, what happens naturally is there starts to be some disconnect, right?
Yeah.
The teens and parents will say, I feel disconnected from my teen. They won't talk to me, or when I talk to them, they won't listen to me.
Yeah.
That's a natural process that happens because they're becoming adult, and they start to pull away, which is a good thing because they're wanting to be independent, but yet at the same time, they need to stay connected.
Yeah.
And so our role as the parent is to be very intentional about trying to maintain and develop and enrich that connection and that relationship with the teen. And that's just so powerful for the teen. And I think we underestimate it, how much impact that can have. And so that's the first place I would point parents, as a way to combat what's going on in social media.
Yeah.
Because then what happens, the connection, and then part of this, how all these things are linked together, your ability to influence or empower your teenager is directly related to the quality of the connection that you have. Right?
I like that.
And so if I've got a really good, deep, and rich connection, when I say to my teen, I don't know if you can believe everything you see on social media, they're going to listen to that, right?
Yes.
They're going to take heed in that, and then we can have a discussion about it. If we're disconnected and they think I'm crazy and I don't have their back, and I say, I don't know if you can believe everything you see on social media, they don't listen, right? They won't take that in. And so part of the reason the connection is so important is because it then opens up the opportunity to have those discussions about, what's appropriate behavior on social media. Should you engage with somebody you don't know, or if there's talk of drugs or sex or alcohol or whatever, how do you could start to have those conversations that are meaningful, but you can't have them unless you got that quality connection first. And then another thing I'll talk to parents about is you go through and you have your teenager pull up their social media and you say, you know what, I'm curious, why don't you show me a post that you think is inappropriate? And let them come in. Oh, see this? What's wrong with that? Let them tell you. Again, that builds connection. It gives the teenager a sense that you're interested in their opinion, right? And you see them. And then you can then interject some of your opinion. You can say, well, this, I don't think this fit, here's one I think's not appropriate.
Yeah.
But you're having a discussion at that point, as opposed to just you sort of dictating or trying to dictate or control what's going on.
Yeah.
So, but it all starts with connection. You got to have that connection first. So that's the first line of defense.
Yeah, I think that's important, that connection piece. And, I want to touch back on that because it's like for a lot of parents, you think you have that connection. You believe you do, at least, and then something happens and you realize, which leads me to this question with trust, is that, okay, maybe I don't have that connection and maybe I can't trust him as much as I thought I could. So I was watching something on TV, and I think it's one of those things where they lure kids out to see if they will fall for it, try to do a fake account, meet them online and see if they will actually come. So this young girl, she was probably 15 years old, and her mom was there, and her mom was like, oh no, she would never go. She would tell me what's going on and she would never go to a stranger's home. Come to find out, the little girl did. The guy asked her to come to the house. She showed up to the house. A grown man opened the door. She walks up the steps. She goes in the bedroom. And then they close the door. And then this person jumps out in all black. And it ended up being her mom. And her mom was so upset, so disappointed. Because she said, I thought we had more trust. I thought I had more trust in her. I thought she trusted me enough to know what was right for her. So how do you, as a parent, in that situation where you think that you can trust your child? And that's when we parent from that fear place. Cause now I'm like, okay, now I got to scare you. I got to scare the hell out of you now because you're not doing what I thought you would do. So what do you tell that parent who feel like, okay, my trust has now just been completely depleted from this person because I thought I can trust her. I thought I taught her better. And now I know that I can't because this could have been deadly for her.
Right. Absolutely. And it's a great question. And there's, a couple things there.
Yeah.
First of all, I would encourage parents, any parent listening to this, to really keep in mind that parenting is a journey.
Yeah.
Right. And every day you're confronted with a new situation, and for most parents, it's the first time they confronted it, right?
Mm-hmm.
If your oldest child, when they turn 14, that's the first time you've ever had a 14-year-old.
Yeah.
And you're dealing with 14-year-old issues, right?
Yeah.
Well, guess what? Next year, they're going to be 15. And that's the first time you ever dealt with a 15-year-old, right? And part of why I say that is because it's ever evolving and changing.
Yeah.
And so don't expect that you're not going to be confronted with situations that you weren't expecting, because it's just going to happen. So the question is then, as you said, how do you respond to that? Where do you go? And so the first thing, again, back to, try to get more grounded in love. And I know that when something like this happens, what you've described, it's fearful, right? You fear
scared
for what could happen. And, that's a part of it. And I think, part of the process, it's interesting, like building connection with the teen would be the parent being vulnerable. That's one of my ways to build connection in the book, is the idea of being vulnerable about that fear. And that's okay. But that allows you, eventually the parent, what I would say though, is you don't want to respond out of that fear. I mean, you're going to have it. So let it process, let it dissipate. You're going to be disappointed, frustrated, anger, whatever that might be. Let it process. And then the next question is, okay, now that I'm sort of regrounded back from a love-based perspective, how do we move forward and rebuild that trust?
Yeah.
And, that comes from, when as your child becomes a teenager and as they move through those teen years, is having that conversation with them. I believe, there's a gap. I like to use the idea of a gap. Now we have this gap of trust that's broken down, and, between the teen and the parent, how do we rebuild that trust and have the teen engage with that a little bit? Have them come up, well, maybe, I have to call every, 10 minutes, or I need to let you check my social media feed, or, but the point is that there's a plan to get to where the trust is regained.
Yeah.
I think that's the key. I think a lot of times what happens in those situations is the parent just responds, and it's like a punishment. It's like, boom, here's what we're going to do.
Yeah, because it's like, you're off social media.
With the teenager, if you say, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take away your phone. We're going to get you off social media. To the teenager, it feels like that's forever. Yeah. Because there's not a plan to bridge the gap to get back to where ultimately they need to be, which is to be able to make a responsible choice, right? I mean, that's the ultimate goal is you want to have the child develop the ability to make a responsible choice. And what we're saying in your scenario you described is they aren't ready for that yet, right? They haven't been able to do that.
Yeah.
And so now let's design a plan that helps you to develop that awareness. And again, that's where every child's different.
Yeah.
Some mature quicker than others. And so, the parent may have to exercise a little bit more control over one child than another as far as controlling the environment, let's say. But always, what I always like to encourage them is with the idea of how do I help that child develop along their journey. It's not just control it until I feel like it's okay. It's control it and what's the next thing I can do to help them learn and grow. And what's the next thing that, can I give them a little bit of responsibility and let's see how they do with that.
Yeah.
Give them a little bit more, see how they do with that. So there's always that plan to grow and learn and develop and communicate that to the child, because then the child feels hopeful, right?
Yeah.
They know that. Another one that I like to use as an example is the idea of when they get the driver's license, the child comes up to you and says, hey, there's an away football game. It's 30 miles across town. I want to go. Well, the parent may not feel comfortable with that, right? And so they say, no, you can't go. Well, if that's all the child hears, to them, it's a hard no forever.
Yeah.
And if the parent says, you know what, I'm not comfortable with that right now. I don't feel like you're quite ready. But let's think about what do we need to do between now and a month from now when the next away game is to help build my confidence and help me feel comfortable and help you feel comfortable so that when that comes up, we are ready to go.
Yeah.
What's the plan? And that has a completely different feel to it than at that point.
Yeah.
Because it's a growth opportunity, and it's back to that parent being able to serve the child and help them develop and grow and learn as a person. So, it's hard when trust is broken. That and another thing I would throw out, a lot of times we talk about using natural consequences. If the child does something, what are the natural consequences? Well, one of the most common ones is a break in trust.
Yeah.
And again, I think that needs to be brought up to the child. Say, hey, you know what? You didn't come home. You were supposed to be home at 10 o'clock and you didn't get home until 10:30. You didn't call. FYI, that breaks the trust between me and you. That damages our relationship. Now we have to work to rebuild it. And that's a consequence. So consequently, I'm not comfortable with you going next week.
Yeah.
Or there's going to be additional restrictions on next week because of that. And that's the consequence of, making a bad choice in that case. So trust it's a huge issue. Obviously.
It really is.
We could go on forever, probably.
I know. It really is, because as soon as that happened, my mindset too was, oh my God, you're off social media. You know what I mean? So I like how you said that there needs to be a plan to regain trust versus if it breaks, you're done. You're never getting on social media again until you're 18 or maybe 21. And I can trust that you can handle it, because that was a very scary situation. And so you're right. A lot of times I remember me when I got in trouble when I was younger, it was not really a plan to regain stuff. It was more so like, you did this, you're not doing this. And that's just it, you know? And so let me get your thoughts on, there's been a lot of debate around the word no with children. And some people feel like, oh, you shouldn't use the word no. It really, I guess it really does something to the kids where it makes them feel like they can't do something. And they say they wanted you to use alternative words like, oh, maybe not right now, or let's do something different. Let's try something else. How do you feel about, I use the word no, but since I've been reading up on it, how people are parenting differently, I'm more conscious in terms of like when I use it and kind of like, should I use a different word at time? So how do you feel about the debate around the word no when it comes to kids?
A couple things. One is context, again, where you're coming from is really critical.
Yeah.
I mean, if you really are coming from a love-based perspective and you say no, it doesn't have it's not as harsh as if it's out of anger, for example. I mean, if you respond out of frustration or anger and you say no, it's going to feel more, it's going to damage the relationship more if it's coming from anger.
Yeah.
As opposed to more of a compassionate no. So I don't know, the idea of no, and again, with a teenager, again, I would encourage parents to think of what's the long-term goal. mean, ultimately, you want your teenager to grow into an adult and to be able to go out and have a joyful and purposeful life and be able to function as an adult, right? And so that's the ultimate goal. And so whatever it is that you would say no about, like, for example, driving across town right now, ultimately they need to be able to do that, right?
Yeah.
Or social media. The other thing I would, social media, if you try to control it too much, and you can imagine, and if you say, I'm taking away your social media, what's immediately the teenager starting to think about?
Yeah.
Oh, how can I
get on
do
it?
this anyway? How can I get around this, right? They're going to start plotting and scheming for how they can do that. So it's not about trying to control it. It's about how do we start to teach responsible behavior? How do we teach them? I mentioned resourcefulness, and how do we, so that's the ultimate goal, which goes back to the idea of it's not no forever, it's not no for now kind of a thing. And then how do we build from that? And how do we go forward? So I think it's okay to say no today, but then on top of that, how do we get you to where you need to be? It's that then growth that's important to add to it. And I think what happens a lot of times, and where the negativity around no is, it's just no without any follow-up.
Yeah, it is.
Or any sense of, okay, where do we go from here?
Yeah.
It's
like a hard no. Yeah.
Well, if you think about it, it's no different than we talked about a math class. If I'm in a math class and I fill out a problem and I get it wrong, in effect, when the teacher says, no, this is wrong, that's a no, right? Yeah. They don't just leave me with, okay, you're stuck there. It's okay, how do we now teach you so that you can get the yes next time, the correct next time? And it's the same thing. I mean, if it's, part of that message, if you just say no without anything else, is you'll never get it. Yeah. You're not good enough. But if you say, no, we can't do this today, but okay, what did we do to grow and move forward? There's that sense of hope that gets attached to it, and an opportunity to grow and develop and learn into it. And it's the same for a younger child too. It's, not right now or no, but how do we, how can we get you there? Yeah, that's true. I guess that's why kids always know like the word no so quickly, because they hear it so much. That's what a lot of parents is saying. Kids learn no so easily because they hear it all the time. So that's why they like, we need to start changing that up. So let me ask you this, because a lot of people talk about you should be friends with your kids, right? When they become teenagers, try to be their friend, and that will help them open up to you. And I know my mom mindset was like, I'm not your friend, I'm your parent. It's a difference. How do you feel about that conversation around being friends with your kids versus being a parent? So the premise of that question, which I love the question, is that because what the parent is missing there, what they feel like they're missing, is a strong connection, right? They don't feel like they can talk, and the teen won't listen to them. And so my solution for that is to try to become their friend, because they talk to their friends. Yeah. And I challenge that premise and say, as a parent, you can still have an awesome connection with your teen, and you can have great conversations with your teen, but as a parent, not as a friend, because part of what the parent provides is wisdom. Yes. Right? You are the parent. That means you're in this place of wisdom and expertise, and you are their parent. I mean, there's no way around that, and you will be forever. And I have adult children now, right? I'm still the parent, even though they're often parents themselves. Yeah. And they still come to me. One of my sons called me 2 days ago, had a question on his tax return. Right? Yeah. He's coming to a place of wisdom, but we have a relationship where we can have that conversation. So I understand the parent's pain point, which is they feel disconnected. But I would encourage them to say, okay, let's build connection in a way that I can still be the parent, the source of wisdom, the source of principles, values, and beliefs, but yet still have really meaningful and engaging conversations. And that starts with being love-based and focusing on building connection. And I'll give you a couple of strategies that I have in my book that will help people maybe get what I'm talking about here. One of them is being compassionate. So when your teenager talks to you, do you listen with compassion? I mean, do you just let them sort of tell you what's going on. The flip side would be without coming up with trying to fix their problems, right? Because we do that a lot. We want to
do
jump
that a
in
lot,
rather than just listening to it and letting them, speak about it. So that's an example of building connection that will allow that teen to be comfortable opening up to you. And then the other, you talked about passing judgment. Let's say the teenager says, hey, my, Billy at school did something, he drank some beer this weekend. Well, as a parent, if you immediately pass judgment and start saying, well, that's all wrong, he needs to never do that, but you start into that kind of conversation, is your teenage son ever going to tell you about it again? No,
probably not, because
you haven't been a safe place for him to share that information, right? And that's about listening with compassion and being forgiving. The other one, another interesting one that's a real challenge for parents, is the idea of being present. And I always say, trust me, your teenager, especially boys, they're not going to walk up to you and say, hey, you know what, I need to talk for a minute. Can we talk? I mean, they're never going to say that to you, right? But at the same time, they might be a little bit, maybe they don't say anything, but you can just tell they're a little down or something. And they're ready to talk, but it's up to the parent to shut their phone off, get away from their email, turn the TV off, whatever it is.
Get off social media.
It's like, and really turn and focus your attention. Again, think about it as service. I'm being of service to the teen. Do you have something you need to share? I'm going to focus right on you, give you 100% of my attention. What is it? Kind of a thing. And so that's a way to build connection. And I'm not doing that from a friend might do the same thing, right? But I'm still doing that from the perspective of being the parent. So that's how I would challenge that is, go ahead and build that connection, but do it. You can do that as a parent. You don't have to be, act like a 16-year-old to be able to do that.
Exactly.
And actually another great thing just to put there is the idea of, I use this premise of seeking to understand. So whatever, when you ask the teen, what's it like being a senior in high school today? Let them tell you. And part of that, you're acknowledging that you're not their friend. You're not another senior in high school. I'm a parent. I grew up 30 years ago, or I was in, 25 years ago, I was in school. I want to know more about what's going on for you. That builds connection, but yet still allows you to be in a different generation, if you will, the parent, having different experiences, but it's a way to sort of bridge that gap. So,
I like that. That's good. What about, because I've been thinking about this one as you've been talking, when it comes to connecting with your teens, is it wise to be vulnerable with them and say, hey, this is some of the things I experienced as a child. Is it okay to do that? Because sometimes we feel like, well, if I tell them that I used to drink when I was a kid, is that going to make them do the same? Or being able to let them know about you as a teenager kind of builds that connection, and you still tell them, hey, I don't want you doing that kind of stuff, but I understand the pressures of it. Is that a good thing to do as a parent?
I would say, you'll love this, it depends, right? That's not a very good answer, but I know.
It's an honest answer.
It depends on the child. I mean, that answer is different for a 13-year-old than for a 19-year-old.
Yes,
right?
That's true.
And to be honest, my wife and I, we have different conversations as our children were older than we do when they were younger. And so maybe, a 19-year-old, you could share some of that information about what you went through. But the other thing I would emphasize again is that while you feel like you have an understanding of what your teen is going through because you went through it, you really don't. A teenager today's experience is completely different. I say completely, it's a lot different than yours when you were a teenager. Right? And so I think we need to acknowledge that and acknowledge that to the teens. Say, hey, our experiences are different. That's where I was saying, seek to understand, try to understand what kind of pressure do you feel to drink right now? I remember when I was a kid, this is what I felt, and that's where you could share what you felt. I would go and we would have, beer would be at a party. You could share something like that if it felt like it was part of the conversation. But then it's like, well, what do you see when you go to parties? Maybe they're seeing people taking ecstasy. I mean, we don't,
completely
so it's
different
to connect on that level. So I think it depends on the conversation, the child, and there may be times where it's appropriate to share some of that.
Yeah.
And to be vulnerable it can be a good thing, because it helps. In some ways, it helps the teen to feel like it's okay to be vulnerable. You're modeling that behavior, so when the teen needs to be vulnerable with you, they're comfortable in doing it, right? You've modeled what it looks like, because you've done it before as well. So, I think there's times where it can be appropriate, but in some cases, like say, especially if they're younger, maybe it's not time to have that
kind of conversation. Yeah. Have you had any parents that come to you that felt like, okay, I've done everything I think I can do to try to connect with my child, but they're still kind of acting out? And what recommendations or what advice can you give that parent that feel like I'm just not getting through to them and they're still kind of acting out and I don't know what steps to take next? Yeah,
it happens. I mean, and that's part of the journey.
Yeah.
And, it's kind of like, what's the old analogy of somebody that works on stone? You hit it. All those hits you think aren't doing anything, but eventually it cracks. Right?
Yeah.
And I would encourage that kind of a thought process for the parent. You just continue to engage and try to connect. And while it may not feel like you're making progress, I think a lot of times you are.
Yeah.
And it's like a slow drip. And so you just continue to do that. That being said, there are some things you can do that can help to, I think, amplify or sort of ramp up connection. One of the great ones is the idea of a shared experience. I'll just share, it's an interesting story. I just love it. And this is one that'll be interesting to see. Sometimes when I tell it, I get those tingles. It's one of those that hits you emotionally. So I was talking to a family minister, a guy who runs the family ministry at one of the local churches, and he shared that they do this event they called a mud run, and it's for mothers and their daughters.
Oh.
And the premise of it is they have like a mile-long course on their campus, and they hose it down, they get it all muddy. And it's got obstacles, right? They're up and under and over and through things. And mom and the daughter sign up for this, and they make their way through this mud run. It's just kind of fun, it's something to do as an experience. Well, the kicker is the mother has been instructed before the mud run to write a letter to their daughter. And the prompt is, right now you're not very beautiful, right? Because she's covered in mud. But here are all the reasons why I love you and I think you're beautiful. And she listed all out. And what happens is at the end of the run, the mothers and the daughters are done. The mothers get handed their letter and they go sit by themselves, and mom gives this letter to the daughter, right? And the daughter reads it. And you can imagine, it's a super impactful experience. That creates a bond between that mother and that daughter. And he told stories of, he would hear back from kids, the daughters that had been through this experience, and they'd say, you know what, I took that letter with me to college. My freshman year, I bet I read it 50 times, right? It was a way to reconnect back to home, reconnect to mom, through that. So that's an example of a shared experience, which if you're having trouble, if there's a particular child where, maybe that connection feels like it's struggling, doing something really sort of outside the box like that might be a way to sort of break that down.
Yeah. I like that.
There's a lot, you just got to keep at it, I think.
Yeah. Parenting is not easy. It really isn't. And like you said, I like the fact that you said it's a journey. And I think that's probably the main thing that as parents, we need to keep in mind, that it is a journey, because each age is different. The child is different at every stage, from the 4 to the 6 to the 10 to the 13. It's a journey. And I like that a lot. And especially when it comes to teenagers, because let me ask you this one question before I'm going to bring the show to an end. Should the connection start earlier? And if it does start earlier, does you continue just to build off it from there? Or can a person, as soon as they hit 13, okay, I'm gonna start building connection now?
I you start building connection the minute they're born.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's all along the way. And it's just sometimes the strategies are a little different when they're teenagers.
Yeah.
Than they are when they're younger. I'll give you a classic example from my family. I have grandchildren, right?
Yeah.
And one of the I'm called Papa Jim. And one of the things that Papa Jim does, especially with the little ones, you know, the 2, 3, 4-year-olds, is I give upside down hugs, right? So I grab them, I flip them upside down, and we get a hug, but it's upside down, right?
Yeah.
But that's an example of a physical contact, and it's a playfulness, and that's a way to build connection, right? So you do that all along with your kids.
Yeah.
And you should be looking for ways to build, you know, the nighttime routine with a 4-year-old builds connection, whatever that routine is that you have.
Yeah.
So you're always, and to be quite honest, the more you do that when they're young, you're going to have that connection when they're a teenager.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you've missed those years, though, I will say it's never too late. You know, love has amazing healing attributes.
Yes.
And if you start to engage with love, I don't care how old they are, you're going to be able to build that bond and that connection. And actually, there are adults, and I've heard, you know, and you've heard these stories too, where a parent and a child haven't spoken to each other for 20 years.
Yeah.
Dad's 65 and the child's, you know, 40, and they reconcile. They are able to heal that relationship. And it's through love that it gets healed, right? It's forgiveness, it's compassion. I mean, those are the things that help those relationships to be healed. And so I would just say it's never too late. So even if you haven't built that connection, and sometimes, you know, like say parents go through a divorce. Yeah. You know, and so dad and child or mom and child, that relationship gets disrupted during that period. And maybe that's from the time the child's 5 till 10 years old. And so you sort of miss some of those years and those opportunities to build connection. But it's never too late, though. You can always regain that. And that's the amazing part of love. Is that it's just never too late.
I like it. Love and a growth mindset, because I think that is completely important.
One more thing. Can I just add one more thing for the parents from a perspective standpoint? I like to encourage parents to think of parenting and the process of parenting as a personal development program for you. Yes. Right? The parent deserves to have a life that's full of joy, purpose, and peace. And parenting can be a great place to practice the skills that allow you to experience that. It can transform your life as much as the teenagers, I guess is my point. Yeah. And go into it under the premise of, this is helping me to be a better person. This is helping me to experience more peace and purpose in my life too. And so it's not only for you, it's for the teen, it's for both of you.
Yeah, I love it. You know, listen, any parents out there that need coaching, need help, you got to go over to the Family Enrichment Academy. Because, I mean, you've talked about so many great things. And I love the fact that the basis of everything is always to lead with love, you know, and I think that's what we need to do more as parents, to move away from fear and to move more with love, Jim. So listen, I appreciate you being on the show. I got to bring you back, because 40 years being married is a show all to itself. You have so much wisdom that you can offer us as married couples. I'm coming up on 5 years on this, on tomorrow, actually. I thought it was Friday, but it's tomorrow. And I love talking to people who've been married for years, because you get so much wisdom, so much advice on how to make it work, because it's not easy.
Yep, I'd be happy to do that. It'd be kind of a fun. And it just as a little bit of backstory. So my wife and I met when we were 15.
Oh, wow.
So it's a long-term love story, if you will. And I would be happy to do that.
Yes, I do.
To be quite honest, that parent relationship is critical to the child as well, right? Yeah. If it's healthy, and it's, in effect, you model what it's like to be in a healthy, loving relationship. And if you can do that, the child is, I always say the children are watching, right? They see what's going on.
They do.
One of the keys for being an effective parent is to have an effective relationship.
And that makes me think about so many more questions I could ask you, but because it makes me think about parents in different parenting styles. And then how do you deal with that when one parent can be more of a disciplinary, where the other parent can kind of be like, just let them do it. And then they kind of bump heads, because I have friends who are like that, who husband and wife who are really different, and they really bump heads when it comes to how they want to discipline the kids.
Yeah. And if you think about it, when you say discipline, sometimes part of where I'll go is that more of a fear-based mindset or a love-based one? And sometimes, and to be honest, the parent that lets them do anything or so as they can do whatever, sometimes that's a fearful mindset too. Yeah. It's like, I don't want to take responsibility for it in some ways. So, and that is very common for there to be differences, because the parents grow up in different homes. Yeah. And so their ideas and the way they feel like, their parenting styles can be different. Yeah. But it all can be worked out. And part of my message is the more love-centered, the better. And it doesn't always work. I mean, you're not always going to get it right. Yeah. Or, sometimes you just don't. And so part of the growth is being able to acknowledge that and say, okay, what can I learn from that experience and move on and try it again. Yeah. Try next time.
Like you said, it's a journey. Listen, you got to pick up the book on how to be the parent your teen needs you to be. Is that I got the right title? Yep. I got it right. Yes. So we got to pick that up. Everything for the family enrichment, the book, everything will be linked down in the show notes and also on the podcast notes as well. I appreciate you, Jim, for coming on. Before we end the show, I asked all my guests, what was some of the best advice you received from a woman? Could be your wife, could be somebody you met. What was some of the best advice?
So probably from my wife. Mm-hmm. And so a little bit of context around it, in that my wife is the outgoing, vivacious one, and I've always been more of the internal, the introvert. If we introvert, extrovert, she was always been more the extrovert, I've been more the introvert. Yeah. And her, she's always encouraged me to let people get to know me more, right? Mm-hmm. For me to be more forthcoming and like what we've been talking about. Yeah. The idea of, my perspective, sharing that more openly and being willing to share that more, because from her perspective, I can be able to help and serve other people, and she felt like I wasn't serving other people to the level that I could. Yeah. And it's, there's a lot of truth to that. So that's something that I'm trying to lean into more and step into more, is the idea of it's like being vulnerable, right?
Yeah, it is.
Put myself out there a little bit more and to share this information. To write the book, you write it down and you hand it to somebody. It's like, it's the fearful responses. What are they going to think? Or what if they don't?
Yes,
well,
yes.
It's part of the process. And so, for me, and what's interesting, as I do that, I feel more on purpose, which makes me just, I feel more purposeful, more fulfilled as I do. Yeah. So it's good for me. So that's why I say it's great advice.
Yeah, it is. That's really good advice. Well, listen, I'm glad she encouraged you to do so. I have had a really good conversation with you. I feel like I could have continued to talk, and because I have more questions I could ask you when it comes to this parenting thing. And I appreciate you for being on the show. Listen, guys, I really hope you enjoy this episode, and you're going to get a lot out of this episode if you're listening or watching on YouTube. I am Shaunie Sanders. This is the Girl Take No Podcast, and I appreciate you guys for watching, and we will see you next time.